I married a man who was brilliant. He was handsome, he was charismatic, and he was loving. Everything a woman looked for in a man for her husband. And I was almost 29, and I really knew what I wanted in a husband, and he met all the criteria. Well, we got married, and everything was fast and furious. Our first anniversary, I was in the hospital with a brand new daughter, and my husband had changed jobs by then about 3 times. He'd always come home and say, I quit my job, but not to worry because he already had a new one lined up, and that was a little disconcerting to me, but he always worked and worked hard. Well, I was pregnant with our second child when he came home at noon one day and said to me, "Sit down, Bonnie, I have something to talk to you about." And it's like, now what? And he said, "I've had a call from God. I'm supposed to be a pastor." And part of our relationship was with the church community. He was the same faith I was, and that was one of the things that drew me to him. So when he announced he wants to be a pastor and has had a call, how could I, as a good Christian, say, "I don't believe you"? That was the first he'd ever mentioned it. It was just like a bomb out of the sky. And by the time he sat me down and told me this, he'd already been to the pastor, talked to him, found out what he needed to do to go to seminary, and it was a done deal. At the second parish is when he started throwing things at me. He started pushing me and shoving me around to get my attention because I wasn't paying attention to him. One time he pulled my hair and a whole handful of hair came out, but it wasn't his fault because I had moved. And the psychological and the mental games were horrendous. So we were in that parish about 6 years, and so by the time the kids were in high school, they didn't want to move. But he was very angry, and so he told me that he was going to take that call, and if I didn't move with him, I'd never see him again, not to look for him because we'd never find him. So we moved to the third parish, and that's where all hell let loose. I had to take the kids out of the home one night, the middle of the night, and the next morning it's like, where do I go, the pastor's wife? I didn't know I was being abused. I just knew that it was dangerous. It was awful. So I finally decided that the bishop was my pastor. I'd start there. Well, the bishop listened to our story, and he said he'd get a hold of my husband. Well, my husband disappeared for 2 days, which made the bishop mad. So when he finally found him and talked to him, he called me and he said, "It's time to go home, Bonnie. Talk to Jim. You take the kids and go home now. And I don't need to hear from you unless you leave again." And I said, "Well, maybe I should go to the abuse shelter." "Oh, no. I was overreacting. That was the worst place to go, so I went back home. When I did go back home, things were okay for a little bit, until my son had that car accident, and that really took a bigger toll on our family. He had hit a tree head on and had major injuries. Well, when he was recovering, my husband would take great liberty at yelling and screaming at me, and that hurt my son's head because he had all these injuries, and they got into it. But the next day when I came home from work, my husband announced he'd been to the county sheriff's office, and there was a warrant for my son's arrest because my son had been trying to protect me, but he was going to have him arrested because he was threatening his dad's life. That's the last straw, because my son was arrested, and I decided at that point something had to happen before somebody in that household died. That's when I went and filed for a divorce. By that time, I had left 7 times and gone back to that man. always things would be different. This time I told him, you leave. And so in all of this process, I finally did get the opportunity to go to the domestic abuse shelter and talk to the people there. They didn't have housing for me or the kids. My son was too old. But they did hook me up with a support group for older battered women. I never realized how downtrodden and beat into the ground I was. There was nothing left of Bonnie. He had controlled my life so totally. When I left him, I found housing. I found a mobile home that cost $7,000. The floors were falling in. The windows were falling out. It was little more than a roof over our head. But it was safe, and it was peaceful. And, you know, I've been alone and maybe lonely, but I've never been afraid in that situation, because peace and quiet and safety, you can't put a price tag on.